Hello and welcome to the first edition of the Sustainable Food and Drink podcast, a series that asks how food and agriculture can achieve impact against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This podcast is brought to you by Lumen Intelligent Sustainability, a subscription insights service for industry, governments and NGOs that explores how to achieve closer alignment with the SDGs with a focus on cocoa, coffee, tea and palm. I'm Oliver Nyberg, a market analyst for Luminous Sustainability and former editor of food and drink industry publications such as Confectionery News. The first edition of our podcast hones in on cocoa in Ecuador. Ecuador is the fourth largest cocoa grower worldwide, but is a minnow compared to Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, where 60% of global production grows. Ecuador's cocoa exports almost tripled between 2010 and 2017, thanks to government and local investment in the sector, but mainly due to the introduction of high-yielding cocoa variety known as CCN 51. CCN 51 to some has heralded a new era for Ecuadorian cocoa, and for others diminished the country's reputation as the world's main fine flavour cocoa destination. Now Ecuador faces a new threat from cadmium, a carcinogenic heavy metal scientists have identified as in high concentrations in Latin American cocoa, which could surpass new limits on cadmium in chocolate, which entered force in the EU this year. Late last year, I was in Ecuador where I met with Francisco Miranda, president of Anecacao, the National Federation of Cocoa Exporters of Ecuador. We discussed the future of sustainability in Ecuador against the backdrop of cadmium and the CCN 51 debate. I started by asking what he made of the EU's new cadmium limits and how they may impact farmers.
I completely believe that it was a 100% political decision masked behind a food safety issue. The original regulation tried to regulate cacao or cacao beans. Quickly they shifted over to chocolate. And what's the effect of it? When you are exporting cacao beans and you have a high cadmium level, you can mix it with low level cadmium beans from different origins and have perfect market cacao or chocolate. When you are doing the efforts or the inspections on chocolate or processed products, you cannot mix already final products to reduce their cadmium efforts. So essentially what's going to end up happening is all the value-added efforts being done by our country as far as pressing beans or transforming them into chocolate, which is where we compete against the European industry, will be lost, and we will go back to being just a raw material provider for our consumers.
But are you saying there's no human risk in finished chocolate using, for example, 100% Ecuadorian beans from an at-risk, potential region like Esmeraldas, for example? Are you saying that there's no, risk?
Well, I'm not saying it. The World Health Organization is. The Alimentary Codex on their writing said that the amount of cadmium present in the highest influence of cadmium in chocolate currently available has no effect on the human health at all, and they have written about it consecutively, saying that it has no proven effect or any effect at all on the average cadmium intake of an individual through chocolate, whereas the amount of cadmium being ingested on an individual by potatoes or meat byproducts or a lot of others have a significantly higher cadmium input into a dietary consumption than chocolate does. So essentially, or answering your question, no, this is not a protection of individuals on a health risk basis. This is just a commercial imposition masked under something different. And even the studies made by HECFA and the European Union standards or health standard organizations have been disputed by the World Health Organization, saying that they were overstating their facts, and they have done so several occasions. And we're just stuck in the middle, having to to leave behind our production for that.
So what will it mean in practice for sourcing regions in Ecuador? Do you expect some at-risk regions to shift to lower risk regions, or what can be done to mitigate the risk in those high cadmium regions?
We have been participant of a lot of cadmium forums internally, and what the consumer and the European countries need to understand is there's no cadmium solution. The same that the solution to the cadmium levels on wheat in Germany in the 90s was to change the regulation. That's the only solution for the cadmium problem in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. You cannot deny the plant a source of nutrition that's currently present on the ground. You cannot remove it. What you can do is inhibit its extraction. But unable to do so, since you are not eliminating it and you're not taking it away, you have to have a permanent blockage of nutrition to eliminate the intake of cadmium from the soil. And as soon as pH levels shift in the ground, were it for a strong rainy season or a cold or a cold wave coming into the ground, pH levels will shift and absorption of cadmium will happen again. So whatever solution being currently offered is at best a short-term solution which will spike cadmium intake eventually.
So how resilient do you think Ecuador will be once those regulations come in? Do you expect cocoa exports in Ecuador to decline, or how do you expect the market will respond?
None whatsoever. Ecuadorian cacao exports will not decline by 1 ton. What will decline is the price. What will decline is the value added. What will decline are the premiums of bean-to-bar manufacturers that want specific cacao from one area, such as Esmeraldas or whatnot. We're not losing overall production. What we're losing are overall premiums, and where those premiums were pinpoint directed to. When you talk about cacao, chocolate manufacturers such as Hoja Verde or Pacari, they have very concerned efforts to improve the livelihood of a community, and they're not talking about world or countrywide, but a specific community where they source their beans from. And for them to have to move away from that community into a different one because of cadmium regulations is unfair to those farmers, because they are not the cause of this problem. This is just something that incidentally fell on their laps.
What's going on in Ecuador to bring more value to the producer, to the farmer?
Essentially, a lot of very hard-working sustainability efforts have been implemented into our country. A lot of certification efforts have come about. As a country, we are still waiting for the ISO sustainability standards to come into effect that will further modify the perception of sustainability. As a country, we have basic standards of agriculture and environment and people skills that are significantly above what the current sustainability effort standards are. So we start further ahead in the sustainability race than what most of the West African countries have.
To what extent, though, do you see future sales to large companies? Because a lot of the large companies will have their own cocoa programs, the Nestle Cocoa Plan, Mondelez Cocoa Life, and so on. And they've built up a network of farmers, typically in West Africa, and they're committed to those groups of farmers. They'll be conducting GPS tracking now and collecting data on them and so on. So they're very much embedded. So how much of a problem does that pose to Ecuadorian exports of cocoa to those kind of companies?
Well, I heard a phrase during one of the later ISO meetings on the sustainability standard that said that most of the industry's efforts were focused in Africa because efforts in Latin America, they call them low-hanging fruit. They were easy to pick, ready and available for the industry, and that's why a lot of the efforts have been going towards West Africa that has that massive cacao production. But as a region, we feel neglected. As a region, we feel that our standards are so significantly above that we can help solve the sustainability goals set forth by the industry for what is a very short-term period that they have. We have very minimal effort needs to come into our country, and same with Peru and Colombia, to accomplish much higher goals than what they are in West Africa. And I'm not saying that the farmers over there don't need the protection of the sustainability programs that are working there. What I'm saying is we need them as well. Our farmers here need the premiums, need the controls, need all these ONGs that are spending millions of dollars in West Africa to have very minimal results, where you can spend hundreds of dollars in Latin America and have significantly improved consistent long-term efforts into a community that needs them.
But if companies like Nestle, Mondelez, Mars and so on source more from Latin America, source more from Ecuador, to what extent does that risk creating humanitarian crisis in West Africa, where farmers whose livelihoods depend on cocoa would be stripped away from them? How do you sort of counteract that?
Well, I'm not asking for them to stop doing their efforts over there. What I'm asking is to leave an even playing field. When the efforts are taxing our crops through non-commercial regulations, such as itchgrass in the US or cadmium in the European Union, that's not leaving an even playing field. They are masking their protection of their former colonies, in the case of Europe, and in the case of the United States, of cheaper cacao coming out of West Africa, by these non-commercial taxes that are being imposed in the production of many Latin American countries. So we're not asking for them to leave those efforts that they have over there aside. Last week I was in Ivory Coast visiting, and I got a first chance look at what poor infrastructure but marvelous land that they have. That's amazing how productive it can be, yet it's not. And the focus of sustainability efforts for a long time was to improve yields for farmers. They were successful in doing so, to the point that we have an excess production worldwide in cacao, and prices are half what they were 2 years ago. So now they are focusing their efforts in replacing crops with food crops and mixing their plantations and whatnot. Again, that's not necessarily a good focus.
Currently, as I understand it, in Ecuador, there is more CCN than fine flavor. How do you expect that balance to develop in future?
The premium paid for fine flavor cocoa, or arriba cocoa as we like to call it, so far isn't too high, except for very specific markets or chocolatiers that pay a significant premium. Most of the market pays bulk prices. Even though the great quality of Ecuadorian cacao genetically exists, a lot of the final flavor characteristics, in my opinion, come from post-harvest procedures. And significant efforts have been made both in Nacional or Arriba flavor beans and CCN to improve their consistency and flavors. On that end, CCN markets have been being developed for the last 10 years to accomplish great flavor goals and introductions to some of the better markets in the world. the strategy of the government on one against the other is to let free market flow. Farmers will decide what is best available for them. There has been constant development of new varieties. The ET family of cacao varieties have had significant improvements in both yields and flavor, but the farmers are wary. The farmers need to make sure that what is a very long-term investment for them is assured to be a good thing, and right now CCN provides that assurance to them.
CCN also, opinions are quite divided on CCN, and as the developed markets, the developed chocolate markets moves to more premium products, is the quality there with CCN 51, do you believe?
I definitely believe so. As a country, we have developed some of the more difficult markets around CCN 51. We have been able to sell significant amount of cocoa to very good European chocolatiers and Japanese chocolatiers out of CCN 51 products. A lot of our better fine flavored chocolates coming out of Ecuador are coming out of CCN 51, which has a problem in its name as a whole, which sounds like a bacterial disease or some sort of weird influenza coming out of a third world country, but essentially is a hybridization of national and Trinitarian varieties that have great yielding, that has a lot of outside pulp, which has made it so that traditional wooden box fermentation techniques are not compatible with it. So a lot of the bad reputation on flavor behind it went by trying to reproduce traditional fermentation techniques into what was a different genetic variety. When you apply modern fermentation techniques with a technique called depulping or removal of excess water before fermentation starts, you end up with very nice, very aromatic flavors that are not similar to nationals, but on their own are very accepted and very recognized by the market.
How do you overturn that perception then? Because you can implement these fermentation practices to improve the quality and try to bring that to buyers, but has the damage already been done to CCN's reputation? What can you do to overturn that?
Well, you have to remember that the market is separated into basic trends. The fine flavor market is on its own a very selective, very long memory market that wants our traditional beans. But the newer generation of chocolatiers are looking forward working with different beans. They are not looking for tradition. They are not even aware of what was a traditional Arriba flavor. And for them, this new fermentation and precision agriculture and fermentation techniques have opened a brand new door on different flavors that are more similar to Madagascar or Tanzania than what they are of a traditional Ecuadorian flavor profile.
That's the end of our podcast. If you're listening on our news sites, please get in touch with your thoughts using the comments box at the end of the page. Mr. Miranda called cadmium a political issue masked behind a food safety issue, and just to say that we have contacted the European Commission about its perspective and will include its comments in the text article accompanying this podcast. Thank you for listening to the Sustainable Food and Drink podcast. This series is brought to you by Luminary Intelligence, an insight service on cocoa, coffee and tea sustainability. The music credit is for Blue Dot Sessions. Thank you and goodbye.